be thinking along those lines. Next class, we will be done with Light in August. There won't be a presentation because everybody will have done theirs. So we'll have the whole class period to talk about it. Then on the 28th of April, we will split the time half and half between going over 3 Faulkner short stories and then reviewing for the final exam. The final exam will take place in here on Thursday night, just like you always meet, Thursday, May 5th, 5:15 to 7:45. So that's pretty much it as far as those sort of that setup goes. So I want to talk about it today. Brian's presentation, the conversation that we have. If we have time, we're going to look at the Judith Wittenberg essay that I asked you to read for today. We may give away a little bit of the final plot. I apologize if that happens, but it's just the way things go. If you think Christmas is going to make it, you might be disappointed, but you probably already knew that one already.
The essay took care of it.
The essay definitely took care of that as well. So that's sort of where we are. So what I want to do is, even before I let Brian kind of take the stage, I want to call your attention to the Faulkner folder. And if you go in there, I've done something a little bit different. You have the quotations from last time. I have not added to that list, but I have done this. I've put up a list of quotations in which I want to compare the authors that we look at. And as I was thinking about this document, the title that I decided to come up with was Making Meaning from Human Experience Through Narrative, because I think that that's what we get in common. Talked about how all 3 of these authors are modernists. You know, Cather is a little bit older and her career started a little bit earlier. She is still, her work is considered contemporary with Faulkner and Hemingway, and I want to talk about how this works. So just cast your mind back to the Song of the Lark. And here I think is one of the key moments in the novel where we start to get this idea of how Cather uses the narrative to construct this meaning. She has this character, Tia Kronberg, who is the central focus, but many people, many critics have suggested that part of the problem with the novel stems from the fact that Tia is so exceptional and so different from those around her that somehow she seems almost beyond the pale of of being a human being. But remember when we talked about this part. Remember, this is when she's coming back from Chicago. This is the last trip that she makes to Moonstone. This is where she ends up being alienated from her family. And she talks about this theme that we identified in the novel, of this feeling Tia had never spoken to any human being until that day when she told Harsanyi that, quote, there had always been something. Remember, he hears her voice not long before she goes back, and she tells him. He's the first person. She tells this idea. She knows that she's different. She always knows that she always has known there's been something. Hitherto, she had felt but one obligation toward it, secrecy, to protect it even from herself. She had always believed that by doing all that was required of her family, her teachers, her pupils, she kept that part of herself from being caught up in the meshes of common things. She took it for granted that someday, when she was older, she would know a great deal more about it. It was as if she had an appointment to meet the rest of herself sometime, somewhere. It was moving to meet her, and she was moving to meet it. That meeting awaited her just as surely as for the girl in the seat behind her, there awaited a hole in the earth already dug. And we talked about, remember, then Cather goes to great lengths to make that comparison between Tia and the sick girl on the train, the girl who's coughing on the train, who's heading out to the west because she thinks the climate's going to help her. But there's an inevitability about this, an inevitability about it. But Cather and other scholars would probably argue that, okay, yes, Tia Kronberg is exceptional. She's going to go on to be this brilliant opera star. But remember, those around her kind of gravitate also around this idea. We talked about this other self, this second self, that she's been waiting. She has known that her talent represents this concept that she's trying to put into words, this idea of the second self. But notice, she's not the only one who benefits from it. She's not the only one who's drawn to it. Other characters are as well. For Tia, so much had begun with a hole in the earth. Yes, she reflected, this new part of her life had all begun that morning when she sat on the clay bank beside Ray Kennedy under the flickering shade of the cottonwood tree. She remembered the way Ray had looked at her that morning. Why had he cared so much? And Wunsch and Dr. Archie and Spanish Johnny, why had they? It was something that had to do with her that made them care, but it was not she. It was something they believed in, but it was not she. Perhaps each of them concealed another person in himself, just as she did. Why was it that they seemed to feel and to hunt for a second person in her and not in each other? Tia frowned up at the dull lamp in the roof of the car. So that kind of brings her back to the moment that she's in on the train. But this idea of those others being drawn to her, okay? This idea of this second self, this idea of something that goes beyond. And remember, later on in this quotation, she talks about her mother even having it a little bit because of her great appreciation for music. For Cather, much of this is represented in the music, and that's why we looked at some of the arias from some of the Wagner operas that are mentioned in the novel here. But notice, just from a sort of straightforward standpoint, and now that you sort of have the comparison to make between Faulkner and Hemingway, how do we get this represented to us narratively from Cather in a very straightforward way? What narrative convention does Cather primarily choose to use in sort of giving us these moments of intense realization? It comes from who or what very literally. On the page of the book, who's telling us this? Tia to some extent. Well, I wouldn't say Cather.
It's an omniscient.
Yeah, third-person omniscient narrator. And I think, we do get the idea clearly that both what Jesse and Jason say are right on. We get the idea that it is what Tia's thinking, and it is also what Cather is trying to relay to us. But this omniscient narrator, and time again in Cather, that's the style that she chooses to give her most profound ideas through, this omniscient narration, which is a fairly traditional way of doing it. Like I said, she's a little bit before Hemingway and Faulkner. She's a little bit before some of the most intense moments of experimentation in modernism came along, but still this idea. I mean, this is a very abstract idea. They're drawn to her, but it wasn't her. There was something in her, but it wasn't her. We know that it's something that's beyond that is drawing them to her. Now, with Hemingway, I think we get the same idea of the meaning of human experience through narration, but he does it in a slightly different way. And I'm trying to suggest here that quite often with Hemingway, he follows a certain pattern, but not always. He certainly has the kind of approach that you would expect to see straightforward through, say, the ending of The Sun Also Rises. It was very hot and bright, and the houses looked sharply white. We turned onto the Grand Via. "Oh, Jake," Brett said, we could have had such a damn good time together." Ahead was a mounted policeman in khaki directing traffic. He raised his baton. The car slowed, suddenly pressing Brett against me. "Yes," I said. "Isn't it pretty to think so?" And so here we have Hemingway doing what makes him Hemingway. Like we talked about before, leaving so much of it below the surface. Notice how we get this seemingly unimportant description in between these 2 moments of dialogue. The dialogue clearly represents something significant. And we made the comparison between this and the way that Brett and Jake were talking in the cab at the beginning of the novel, and how that event took place at night. And this one taking place in just almost the glaring sunlight, driving down the Gran Via in Madrid. You couldn't probably think of a brighter place to do it. And this idea of clearly something between them. And the whole basis of our debate, does Jake change at the end of the novel or not? A lot of it is wrapped up in how we read and how we interpret the human interaction that is going on here. And Hemingway is rarely going to give us more than this. Sometimes he does, though. Sometimes we do get a little bit into the narrator's mind. He often likes to use first person. Doesn't always use first person narration, but often does. Remember at the very beginning of the novel, Jake said, "Then I thought of her walking up the street and stepping into the car. as I had last seen her. And of course, in a little while I felt like Helligan. It's awfully easy to be hard-boiled about everything in the daytime, but at night it is another thing. So Hemingway doesn't lead us completely, sort of push us completely adrift to only depend on the dialogue. But these kinds of moments are sparing, and again, certainly not as clearly laid out as we get with Kavner. Then we also get this, and we talked about it at the time, how unique, and I wouldn't go maybe go